Coming up, labor unrest and the threat of devaluation. Plus, why I got vaccinated and why you should too.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of May the 3rd. Well, the big topic of concern in Belize is the ongoing showdown between labor unions and the government of Belize. As you no doubt know, Belize is facing a serious economic crisis. A crisis that had been simmering for nearly 40 years thanks to systemic corruption and poor fiscal management. But now, that crisis has been brought to the point of boiling over due to the devastating economic impacts of COVID-19. Belize is the 6th most indebted country in the world. And with tourism, our largest employer and foreign exchange earner, on life support for well over a year, the government of Belize simply does not have the revenues it needs to pay its bills and to keep the economy going. Last month, the Prime Minister, who is also the Minister of Finance, delivered his budget for the fiscal year 2021-2022, and he spent most of his 83-minute budget speech blaming the UDP, which I suppose is not unexpected, as the UDP spent most of the last 12 years in office blaming the previous PUP administration. So, was there actually anything in the budget intended to fix this financial mess? Not really, other than a 10% salary cut for public workers and teachers, and a freeze on salary increments for the next 3 years. Slashing salaries will net about a $60 million reduction in expenses, while putting a stop on raises will save an additional $20 million per year. But even with that modest reduction to the government payroll, the budget deficit for the next year is still forecast to be at $275 million. That means that despite our national debt already being over 130% of GDP, the government is going to have to add more than $250 million to the $4 billion we already owe, just to keep the country running. Unless by some miracle, GOB can increase revenues. Now, the PM did mention that the government must do a better job of collecting taxes, and that currently government has only been collecting about 72% of what taxpayers actually owe. He also said that whether current tariffs will be sufficient and whether or not supplemental revenues will be required will depend on people paying their taxes. In other words, if the people who have enjoyed evading taxes continue to do so, we can expect to see a tax hike, likely an increase in GST, in the very near future. But even the PM himself doesn't appear very confident about collecting those hard pay taxes. When pressed immediately after delivering his budget about a reported $11 million in outstanding GST owed by his own sister on behalf of Smart, Briseno told reporters that the amount of outstanding taxes is usually reported as much higher than it should be because of faulty calculations by the tax department, and that settling these sorts of tax arrears always involves a negotiation process where government will ultimately agree to accept far less than what might be owed. So don't hold your breath waiting for tax collectors to dig government out of this financial hole. Interestingly, no sooner did teachers begin picketing Smart and BTL over alleged tax arrears owed by each of the telecommunication companies than both Smart and BTL released statements to the media claiming that they had settled all their outstanding accounts with the tax department. In the case of Smart, they went from no less than the Prime Minister acknowledging that $11 million in outstanding GST was on the books to Smart suddenly owing nothing. And what proof of payment did Smart produce to clear up this matter? A press release from Smart on Smart letterhead. So not a very good start to the so-called enhanced efforts by GOB to collect outstanding taxes. It also doesn't appear that government is prepared to put in any real austerity measures that would include cracking down on the corruption and hustling that robs tens or possibly hundreds of millions of dollars from our national coffers every year. Sure, Cabinet has finally agreed to a 15% wage reduction and a 50% reduction in some of their allowances, something the PM had originally dismissed as being so insignificant as to not even really be worth considering. But what the unions and most hard-working, honest Belizeans want to see is a legitimate attempt to stop corruption and waste. That is what the Briceño government needed to bring to the table before asking anyone to sacrifice their salaries. That's not to say that the salary cuts would still not be necessary, because as I mentioned earlier, the budget deficit for this year is over $250 million. But GOB needed to present a much more comprehensive plan to save money and improve revenues if they were going to ask for teachers and public workers to accept a wage cut and a 3-year increment freeze. Back in January, Deputy Prime Minister Cordell Hyde was blasting the previous administration for the amount of money paid out in so-called compensation for land scams. As much as $15 million in September of 2020 alone. But then just a few weeks ago, the court ordered GOB to compensate Ivor Realty, a company owned by the daughter of Love FM's Renny Villanueva, for more than $5 million. $5 million because that's what the actual market value should have been for 102 acres of land in the Turneffe Island Range that Ivor Realty was allowed to purchase for a mere $27,000, just days before the 2008 general election. So what has the current government done to stem the bleeding at the Lands Department and to put a stop to one of the most blatant examples of absolute corruption? Nothing. Now, while compensation for bogus land deals might not be a line item in the national budget, the reality is GOB could save at least $10 million annually by passing a law that says if the Ministry of Natural Resources makes a so-called mistake and sells a parcel of land for well below market value, then the only recourse is to return the purchase price plus interest when reacquiring that land. Look, if police can arrest you for buying a tablet for $75 because you should obviously know it is stolen property, then anyone who buys 102 acres on a key for $5 million below market value should not be considered a victim. Not only has the new government refused to enact any sort of legislation to stop the hustling at lands, they've decided that the Commission of Inquiry that was supposed to be digging into the sins of the Barrow administration with the aim of preventing the fleecing of government assets in the future is no longer serving their political purpose now that the municipal elections are over. Literally pulling the plug on the commission as soon as it became apparent that fingers were going to be pointed at both parties. And then there is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which was signed by Belize following the 2016 teacher strike, but has yet to be implemented. Showing that GOB was serious about implementing UNCAC would have been a good place to start before telling workers that they have to take a pay cut, like it or not. But here we are. The Public Service Union has served notice of industrial action, and walkouts are expected to begin on Tuesday of this week. The Belize National Teachers Union began their own labor action last week, walking out of classrooms or refusing to log in for online classes, and instead taking to the streets in a series of planned protests. The Nurses Association has pledged their support for the unions, and the Police Association has recorded, in writing, their opposition to any salary reduction. And those police officers certainly seem to be showing a lot of discretion so far with union protesters who are clearly violating COVID-19 regulations regarding gatherings. Belize is very much on the precipice of a major labor strike, and it appears nothing is being done to prevent that from happening. Because, in my opinion, the government of Belize wants the unions to go out on strike. Now, I know that sounds crazy when the relationship between the unions and the government of the day is considered one of the best indicators for either party's political future. But the Briceño administration still has 4.5 years to mend fences before seeking re-election. And a massive strike now is the surest way to realize the savings that GOB wants. Because despite what some people might mistakenly believe, especially after the way the 2016 teacher strike was settled, you don't get paid while you're on strike. There are about 250 working days in a year, even less for teachers. So a 25-day strike would be equivalent to a 10% payroll savings for government. Now, a 25-day strike would be tough on the country and on the government. But how about a 10 or 12-day strike? That wouldn't be too hard to handle, especially in these times with such reduced economic activity and lack of productivity due to COVID-19. So I think GOB's strategy is to just let everyone strike for a few weeks before negotiating a settlement that sees the unions accept a 5% pay cut. The unions will be able to claim some sort of victory, while government will realize their intended savings, and then some. And the other reason why I think GOB wants a work stoppage is because they have basically been goading the unions into a dispute with a series of propaganda ads that frame teachers and public workers as being selfish and unpatriotic. Most recently, it appears that the government PR machine has dispatched messengers to float the idea that if the unions don't accept the wage cut, the Belize dollar will be devalued, and that will be solely the fault of those greedy teachers and public workers who refused to make sacrifices for the good of all Belizeans. Now, I'm no economist, but I understand enough about economics to know that the devaluation of the Belize dollar is almost certainly not going to happen. And if it does, it won't be because anyone refused a pay cut. First, the Belize dollar is not traded. It has absolutely no value outside of Belize. Second, the Central Bank of Belize controls our monetary policy, which includes the peg value of our dollar. Our central bank, which very much takes direction from the Minister of Finance, has set the peg of the Belize dollar at 2-to-1 to the US dollar since 1976. So if the Belize dollar was ever to be devalued, it would be at the instructions of the governor of the Central Bank of Belize. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplified explanation, but how Central Bank establishes that our dollar is worth 50 cents US is based on the amount of US dollars available for 3 months of imports. That's because nearly every single thing we import has to be paid for with US dollars. And as long as there are enough US dollars available for imports, then it's accepted that the purchasing power of the Belize dollars in circulation is 2 Belize for every 1 US. Even during a financial crisis like our current situation, when the amount of foreign reserves begin to dwindle because of lack of tourism, the 2-to-1 peg remains stable because the economy contracts, meaning there is less demand for imports. Now, less USD in reserve is a huge problem for GOB because about 70% of our national debt is external and must be repaid in US dollars. But devaluing the Belize dollar will not increase the amount of USD available from central bank. Nor will devaluation improve Belize's ability to earn foreign exchange. Industrialized countries that export a lot of goods will adjust their monetary policy from time to time to lower the value of their own currency in order to boost exports. When the value of the Canadian dollar or the Mexican peso drops compared to the US dollar, exports from those countries increase because the goods they produce become cheaper. That leads to economic growth, even if their currency is not as valuable as it was before. But because those countries also produce a lot of goods for the domestic market, the purchasing power of its citizens is not diminished all that much. The slight increase in the cost of imports is offset by the growth in the economy. However, that formula will never work for Belize because we produce so little and import so much. Our biggest export is actually tourism, and that product is already valued in US dollars. You could change the peg of the Belize dollar to 4 to 1 tomorrow, but that hotel room in San Pedro that goes for US $250 a night will still cost visitors US $250 per night. Most of our exported commodities, such as sugar, are sold under negotiated quotas for USD or euros. So we're not going to export even 1 more pound of sugar just because our local currency is worth less. And because so much of what we consume is imported, the cost of living will automatically increase by whatever amount the Belize dollar is devalued. The increased cost in living will either lead to runaway inflation or a massive retraction of the economy as people no longer have money for anything other than the absolute basics of survival. There's actually only one benefit for GOB if they were to devalue our dollar, and that would be to stretch how far external borrowing could go to pay domestic debts. For example, if government needs 30 million Belize dollars to make payroll right now, they have to borrow 15 million US to do that. But devalue the dollar, now you only need to borrow maybe 10 million or 7.5 million to pay your public workers. However, that is a very temporary solution, and the havoc that devaluation would wreak on the Belizean economy would be far worse than the current economic crisis. And finally, any government that officially devalued the Belize dollar would be committing political suicide. Even the venerable People's United Party would never come back from that. George Price's grand old party would be dead and buried, no matter how much they tried to blame the UDP for making the mess and leaving them no other choice. So when any politician or one of their minions tells you that our dollar is at risk of being devalued if the unions don't bend over and take their 10% bukut, they are fear-mongering, plain and simple. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to experience a de facto devaluation due to a scarcity of US dollars. In fact, the cost of most imported goods has been rising significantly in the last few months, and I suspect this could be due in part to merchants needing to source foreign exchange on the black market. We've seen this before whenever USD is in short supply. Back in the early 2000s, BTL was regularly purchasing millions of black market US dollars for as much as $2.20, until it came to light in 2005 that the company had lost $7.6 million doing black market exchanges with a couple of rather notorious local businessmen. But back to the present and the showdown, or should I say stalemate, between the unions and GOB. GOB is proceeding with pay cuts, and they don't need the unions to agree to anything. Cabinet announced on April 22nd that the minister responsible for the public service will proceed with fixing the salaries of public employees. So I have to wonder, what's the point of striking now? Now, just to be clear, I am not saying I don't support the action of the unions in protesting against government, and I'm definitely not telling anyone to just shut up and accept a pay cut lying down. But I think the unions are fooling themselves if they believe they will avoid a wage reduction by walking off the job. Like I said earlier, going on strike will ultimately save GOB money. And by the time the unions negotiate any sort of settlement, whatever gains they make will almost certainly be offset by lost wages while out on strike. So my advice to the unions is to find something else other than just money to bargain about. Because the longer the unions make this only about money, the more support they will lose from the public at large. One way or another, that 10% is coming out of their pockets. Whether or not that is fair is a moot point. But just like I said back on episode 29 of this podcast, the unions have an opportunity to force government into making some real and meaningful reforms that will stem the bleeding from corruption and fiscal mismanagement. If you haven't heard that episode, I strongly suggest you go back and listen to my list of financial and legal reforms that GOB could enact today if they really wanted to fix Belize's financial situation. Only that will prevent a future crisis like the one facing Belize today from happening again.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXAProductions.com.
Well, I am very happy to tell you that I am one of the 42,000 Belizeans who have received their first COVID-19 vaccine. I got my shot just over 2 weeks ago, which means, according to the science, I have just crossed the threshold to where my body has developed enough antibodies that even if I catch the virus, I won't get seriously ill or die from it. I cannot tell you how much of a relief that is for me mentally. For the first time in over a year, I was able to go grocery shopping without worrying that some chin masker or some other COVIDiot who doesn't understand what 6 feet is could be the reason that I end up at the KHMH or worse. Now, that's not to say I still don't give plenty of people the stink eye when I see them disregarding safety protocols, but at least my chances of catching the virus are considerably less than they were just a few weeks ago. And the odds of me getting seriously ill or kicking the bucket from COVID-19 are now virtually nil. Yes, I did feel a few side effects from the vaccine, but nothing serious. I got my injection on a Saturday morning, and by early Sunday evening, I started feeling like I was coming down with the flu. So I went to bed early. I slept for about 12 hours, and when I woke up Monday morning, I was good to go. Of course, everybody's experience varies. Some people feel absolutely no side effects, while others find themselves down and out with flu-like symptoms for a couple of days. But this I know, even if I had experienced the worst side effects, it would still be worth it. Because I can't tell you how amazing it feels to know that you are protected from COVID-19 and that you have done something that will ultimately help end this pandemic. So my advice to you, no, my plea with you is this. If you have not yet been vaccinated, please do so as soon as you are eligible. In fact, don't even wait for your phase to be open. Check with a vaccination clinic now, because reports are that anyone who wants to be vaccinated is being accommodated. I wasn't supposed to be eligible until phase 5, but I was actually recruited by a friend of a friend who is married to a doctor because the clinic he works at needed people to get vaccinated. You see, every day unused vaccines are going to waste because not enough people are turning up to get vaccinated. Currently, only about 68% of the people the Ministry of Health and Wellness had expected to receive the vaccine by now have done so. The big area of concern for people refusing to get vaccinated are the elderly, teachers, and police. The next phase of the vaccine rollout is supposed to be 10,000 public employees. And with the current dispute with GOB heating up, I'm worried that a large number will opt out as some sort of protest. But the biggest reasons why I think Belizeans are not getting vaccinated in the numbers we expected are misinformation and general complacency. The amount of anti-vax misinformation being shared on social media is alarming. And many of the same people who last year told you not to be afraid or not to wear a mask or not to stay home because, after all, the virus only kills 2 out of every 100 people, are now warning you not to get vaccinated because 9 out of 400 million people might have died from a blood clot after getting vaccinated. A claim that is yet to be scientifically proven. And what about all those people who just last year were so eager to take ivermectin an anti-parasite medicine intended for animals. How come I don't see any of them getting vaccinated or encouraging others to do so? And then on top of all the anti-vax nonsense, there is vaccine apathy from a lot of people who believe the pandemic is winding down. And in some ways, I can't blame them for feeling that false sense of security. The Minister of Health and Wellness, who seems to take more victory laps than Lewis Hamilton, has been telling us for months about what a great job his ministry is doing in winning the war on COVID-19. And yes, health officials do deserve acknowledgement that the situation has improved greatly since December of last year. But the battle is far from over. Belize recorded 212 new infections, including 6 deaths in April alone. Those numbers should concern you because they are not unlike what Belize was experiencing in August and September, and we all know how the rest of 2020 turned out. So I have no doubt that there will be a third wave. In fact, given that we are seeing a steady increase in the number of daily positives, including 22 new cases on Friday, I think that third wave has already begun. And that's why it's important that you get vaccinated as soon as possible. Belize is never going to achieve so-called herd immunity. The main reason is that too much of our population is under the age of 18, and none of the vaccines are approved for use for anyone under 18. In fact, even if every single person who is eligible to get vaccinated did so, it would only be about 58% of our total population. And unfortunately, the trend line suggests that only 68% of those who are eligible are getting vaccinated. So when all is said and done, only about 35% of Belizeans will be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. That's a far cry from the misleading cabinet release that claimed, quote, 70% of all Belizeans who want to get vaccinated will be vaccinated by September, end quote. But like I said, victory laps. So if you're waiting for the rest of the herd to get immunity so you can just avoid getting jabbed, think again. Your best option is to take matter into your own hands, or rather your own arm. If you are 18 years or older, please go get your shot. Okay, as always, it's time to big up all the other Belizean podcasters out there. And it's amazing how many I have to mention this time around. The Natasha Stewart podcast and 2 Teaspoons of Belize each dropped their final episodes of the season in the last few weeks. Hopefully they'll be back real soon with new episodes. It's great to see that the Belize Travelcast put out a new episode for the first time in a few months. So welcome back Javier Gutierrez and everyone at the Belize Travelcast. Dominique Norales now has 9 episodes of her thought-provoking podcast, Walasaha. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely do so now. Toucan View's latest episode looks at how corruption has become a way of life in Belize and whether or not the unions can save us. Renisha Gentle keeps putting out great episodes of The Gentle Perspective, mostly on YouTube, but some of her shows also get released as audio podcasts as well. And Paul Schmidt's The Opinionated Cruffy wonders if government de tekwi for kunamunu. But that's not all, because I have found several more Belizean podcasts in the last few weeks that I want you to know about. Andre Habet and Digna Ramirez have a brand new podcast called Mata Fire that deals with environmental issues facing Belize. Kelsey Codd has a podcast called Raw and Uncut with Kelsey Codd. Now, Kelsey only put out 3 episodes about 2 months ago, but I really hope there will be more coming from her soon. Tyler J. Bermudez hosts the Real Thai Belize podcast. His show deals with all the issues currently facing Belize, such as the dispute with the unions, crime, government, and more. He's been putting out a new episode every Friday without fail for the past 9 weeks. So, Ty, mad props for that. I know exactly how hard it is to try and produce a weekly podcast. And here's the kicker. Ty is only 16 years old. And proving that no matter your age or ability, podcasting can be for anyone, I am so happy to give a shout out to Juan Reyna, who recently launched his podcast on YouTube called The Blind Spot. In case you didn't guess from the name of his show, Juan is visually impaired. I'll post links to all these podcasts in the notes for this episode. I also want to say a special thank you to Channel 5 and reporter Paul Lopez for doing a feature story on the growth of podcasting in Belize. I'll have a link to that as well in the show notes. Remember, you can be part of the Belize podcast movement by sharing Brent's 2 cents with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. And don't forget to subscribe to all the great Belizean podcasts out there on your favorite app so you never miss an episode from any of us. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at 2 Cents Belize. And I would especially love it if you would leave a voice message for the podcast about anything you want to talk about. Like, for example, are you planning to get vaccinated? Why or why not? You'll find a link to do just that in the description for this episode. Finally, I want to say thank you to Leonardo for supporting this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee. If you'd like to join Leonardo and all the other really good people who help support Brent's 2 cents, you'll find a link for Buy Me a Coffee in the description for this show. A coffee is only $3 US or $6 Belize, but it really helps me to cover the costs of producing this podcast. And that's going to do it for episode 31 of Brent's 2 cents. Until next time, please continue wearing your masks, wash your hands, stay home as much as possible, get vaccinated, and most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.